Hey Tim,
Hey Matt, how are you?
good good morning to you.
Yeah. Good afternoon, evening to you.
Yeah, glad to see you're still around, even though it's tomorrow uh, in the
Oh,
future.
yeah.
Um, the world's a wild place right now. Um, but we're going back to the beginning. Well, almost to the beginning. I guess Plato is already quite late as far as the evolution of the philosophy of nature goes.
He's already trying to synthesize different positions, isn't he?
Mhm.
Maybe is he maybe the first person in Western philosophy who's trying to eat all the cake?
He's certainly attempting a grand synthesis of sorts. And he's written a text that is so generative that it can be interpreted, you know,
Mm,
in so many ways that I had stayed in print for several thousand years, a couple thousand years, and that
yeah.
we're still very interested in talking about it here in 2025. You know, Whitehead was very interested in it 100 years ago. Schelling, who I guess we'll be focusing mostly on today, was very interested in it 200 and 235 years ago ish. Um,
When he
wait,
was a kid.
yeah, teenager.
Yeah.
Um, he was reading Plato in the original Greek, I think, as a 14-year-old, um, and is writing his essay on the Timaeus as a 19-year-old when he was still at seminary at Tübingen Stift, hanging out with Hegel, roommates with Hegel and Holderlin at the time. Um, and yeah, many commentators here, including Triton, Tyler Triton, point out that this really forms the core of his whole philosophical pursuit over his whole lifetime. The question of nature being right at the center of his later inversion of Kant, but he's already inverting Kant here, in
Mm.
some ways. Um,
Well, and already reading Plato in a Kantian way, though, as well. Uh,
right.
so I don't think you said, but the work of Plato's that we're talking about is the Timaeus, of course.
Did I not? Yeah, the Timaeus. Uh,
Sure.
I mean, yeah, it almost goes without saying. I think it was the only, or one of the only, it was the Timaeus and the Republic, I guess, that were uh, available in Europe through most of, the ancient and medieval period. And it wasn't until like the Renaissance that the rest of the Platonic corpus started to be widely translated and read. And so, um, when you think,
Mm,
for in the medieval period, when you thought of Plato, it was like Timaeus was what you were talking about. Um, and I guess it's one of the later dialogues. And yeah, he's definitely trying to have his cake and eat it. I mean, the theory of forms plays a significant role, but he's really uh, Plato is it's like a trial by fire of the theory of forms, bringing the forms into relation to necessity or fate or ananke. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce the Greek, but
mm,
it's this indefinite multiplicity, that which resists the intellect, that which is indeterminate, um,
mm.
necessity, as it's often translated, though not deterministic in the sense
Yeah.
that we mean that today, but actually almost the opposite, more like chance. Um, and right at the beginning of this dialogue, I know we're not going to focus too much on Plato's Timaeus, but I think, we've talked about Jung's problem of the fourth, and I feel like that is what's at stake. I mean, it's both the problem of the third and the problem of the fourth in the Timaeus.
Mm,
But the first line, Socrates asking, one, two, three, what has become of the fourth? He asks Timaeus, who was one of their guests on the prior day. And Timaeus answers, oh, he has fallen sick, Socrates. He's ill, and he would not willingly have missed unless he had fallen ill. And so there's a missing fourth here. And then there's the reason for the fourth interlocutor missing is he's fallen ill. And I feel like illness is a great example of precisely what is meant by necessity here, what is meant by the limit, the um, I shouldn't say limitation, because in this context, the limited and the unlimited, it's really the unlimited or the unruly aspect of matter, that which makes us sick. It interrupts the unity of our organism, right? And
Well,
so that,
to put in the Jungian register, it's like the numinous or
right,
autonomous nature, that which will not be subdued, right? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So um, we're we're confronting here the meeting place of the ideas and materiality, or what Plato called the receptacle. And Schelling tries to offer a reading of Plato that I really, really like. And um, whether or not I mean, he's obviously projecting some Kantian categories onto Plato, but I think part of what's at play in uh, the 1794 essay of Schelling's is he wants to save Plato from the charge of some kind of a two-world dualism and save
Mm,
him from the charge of just being, oh, one of those pre-Kantian dogmatic
mm,
metaphysicians. He wants
mm,
to understand Plato as kind of already being transcendental, um, which is a fair reading, if only because Kant is so Platonic in his
mm,
understanding of the ideas of reason and their interplay um, with the categories of understanding and with our sensible uh, intuitions. Um, so it's yeah, such a generative text. So what? Yeah, tell me what are your first impressions here, and how does this uh, inform the landscape of ideas we've been discussing in prior sessions?
yeah. No, I mean, I obviously really like Schelling's take as well, and I'm really looking forward to getting into a discussion of the chora and of this. It's an inversion of Platonism in a sense, or an inversion of Neoplatonism, certainly, as Tyler Tritton or Triton in the other article that we read, which is a really good one. So thanks for sending me that. He frames it specifically in terms of that inversion of Plotinus and also Proclus as a kind of in between figure, maybe in some aspects more like Schelling, in some aspects more like Plotinus. And so, when we think of Kant, people always, Kant himself would talk of the Copernican inversion, right, that he was bringing back. But I think you and I have said before that it's also like a Platonic reversion, to your point and to Schelling's point here. But because we're going to talk about the Cora a lot, and Schelling's take on that, but I think yeah, we'll also dip into the Timaeus itself and read some of the just get cherry pick a few quotes. I would like to, especially from that section on necessity and on the Cora, because I really love that bit. And we can talk about Plato's motivations there because different scholars have had very different ideas. And as you say, it's such a generative text. And one of the amazing things about always reading the Timaeus is just how many of the thought forms that we're still deploying, still utilizing today are present. I mean, again, we've said this. Plato was this grand canalizer, and attractor in kind of Western thought, and footnotes to Plato. It's but the Timaeus it's just really really striking in that regard. But because we're going to talk about the Cora, this kind that is difficult and obscure, I think it would be appropriate to start by calling now on a savior God to see us safely through a strange and unusual argument to a likely conclusion, to quote Timaeus there. And then even before diving into that, I want to just draw attention. One thing that I really like is that the journal that this Tyler Tritton article, which I'm sure you'll link to, is published in, which is what is it, the official journal of the North American Shelling Society, is called Kabiri, right? And obviously you're quite the Goethean, so we know about the Kabiri from part two of Goethe's Faust, but it connects really nicely to as you already referenced our discussion of Jung and the problem of the fourth. Although again, I like that you already foreshadowed that it's is it the problem of the third or the problem of the fourth in the Timaeus, because the Cora really is the third, right? Um, but the function or the operations that are attributed to the Cora here are also attributed to the fourth in Jung's essay, The Problem of the Fourth, and he
Mhm.
talks about the Kabiri, these basically like they're these chthonic gods, right? But they're sort of impish, trickster-like, and of course, Jung is analogizing them with the unconscious, and not just as tricksters that kind of force a slip of the tongue or embarrass the person who takes themselves too seriously and all of that, but actually also as the generative principle for psyche that is autonomous from the conscious mind, that cannot be subjugated, cannot be subdued by sort of rational categories, and that we shouldn't attempt to, because and Jung references Plato and the missing fourth, like the fourth who didn't come, but also he references Goethe referencing Plato in exactly that little thing that you read from the very beginning of the Timaeus. And it's like it's an error to try and or to imagine that one could subdue that generative substrate and maybe substance, and maybe we can get into that as well, and how that plays out, and whether it is best considered to be substance or like the substance, so to speak. But yeah, it's an error to imagine that one can subdue that so that one could achieve, a purely rational psyche or something like that, because that would also be a dead psyche, like a world without that generative, numinous, I would say in a more evolutionary, way, like evolutionary biology way, without the capacity for arbitrary variation and the capacity for arbitrary variation to accumulate in the kind of interstices between layers of reality and things like that, well, there would be no change, and we'd actually be in the perniciously Platonistic world of a Laplace, a completely deterministic world. So yes, this indeterminate necessity, and it's the necessity of contingency, and also the contingency of necessity, like there's all this sort of paradoxical stuff mingling together there, is really nice and really captured in this image of the Kabiri and the way that Jung talks about it. So I just really like that that's also the name of the journal, like before we even get into the discussion of the content. And so I got a little quote from Faust 2, from Goethe's Faust Part 2, just the Kabiri are gods wondrously their own, who are always making themselves and never know what they are. So they're unconscious in this sense that they're not self-reflecting, they're not rational in that recursive sense of the conscious analytical psyche, but they are always making themselves their generative, and I think that links to maybe where Schelling is partly taking this, but I wonder if we can explore some tensions in Schelling's thought that, again, which you know better than I do, but when we go through this essay, because um, well, yeah, but it is taking it to this point where the chora, the generative substance, the receptacle, the space, all of these different terms that get used for it, is generating its own. It's a productive generative principle on its own. It's self-making, and it contains the ideas in a kind of shadowy or prefiguring way, right? And so if the chora is self-organizing, self-generating, always making itself, in some sense, the ideas themselves would be, and this would be quite at odds, I think, with the Timaeus, actually. But the ideas would actually be themselves arising from that first principle, and then, constraining it, kind of in the manner of virtual governors, right? And we'll get there, because I love actually Plato's discussion of the chaotic nature of the chora, and I think he really does prefigure a thought of self-organization there. But I think, and I don't think it's controversial to say this, but you can respond, that there's a lot of tension within this cosmology, within Plato's own cosmology, because on the one hand, you can read it maybe in this Schellingian way, or moving in this direction towards a kind of generative substrate which does it for itself and generates the other operators. Or you can have, co-eternals, the paradigm, and the and you could maybe say all three things, intellect, forms, and substrate are all co-eternal, and those would be quite different readings in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you highlighted the name of the journal. Um, Maybe Schelling did he um, had a lecture series on the deities of Samothrace later in his life, and actually the Plato's Timaeus is set uh, narratively after the Republic, which is said to have been a conversation that took place the day of or the day after a festival for a Thracian deity. And so, yeah, these beings are abound in this dialogue and response to the Timaeus over millennia. But that's it's actually significant here because of how myth and theory are coming together in the Timaeus and the way that, in the deities of Samothrace uh, lectures that Schelling gave. It's been a while since I've read those, but he sees a Trinitarian sort of structure there, and he's trying to navigate this evolution of consciousness, basically, whereby we move from this mythic mode interacting with semi-autonomous beings to a conceptual mode where that autonomy seems to be it's the human intellect and our capacity for conceptual thought seems to domesticate the unruliness of these deities and turn them into concepts that we have power over and that sort of do our bidding rather than us being sort of numinously enraptured or um, inspired by them. And I think that, you know, Timaeus, one of the things that Plato does in the Timaeus, which you could describe as, you know, um, having his cake, is trying to do justice both to the mythic and to the rational or theoretical modes. And that ultimately, in order to give an account of the universe as a whole, the reason it's so difficult to do that is precisely because we can't finally theorize this remainder, this necessity, this materiality. It resists the reduction to ideas, to concepts, right?
I think that's so important, and I think that's why I like to refer to the necessity of arbitrary variation in evolution. And again, there are pretty concrete ways we can talk about that the manifestation of that arbitrary variation, which you and I've talked about a number of times. But it's the arbitrariness of it and the fact that in the triadic schematization of an evolutionary process, in a sort of broadly Peircean sense, but again, it's already there in Erasmus Darwin, and I think it's probably a generic way of thinking about evolution. But people will usually reference Richard Lewontin, actually, but then you're talking about like 1970 for this scheme. But the variation, selection, inheritance, or variation, differential survival and selection. And so sometimes the order is changed and the terms are slightly changed, but it's the same scheme. Variation, though, is first. And one thing I'd like to also just really highlight in passing is that um, the autonomy or the numinous character of this variational principle is in fact a condition of a precondition for the autonomy of any limited being, like us, for example, right? So if you try to do away with this autonomous variation, so if you have a dream of complete explanation, basically, and this again in Jungian terms, if you have the dream that you're going to subdue the unconscious completely to some sort of rational schematism. And of course, Jung had his own schemes, but he was always himself quick to say, these are just they're heuristics, they're maps. We need to navigate, but don't get it twisted. Don't try to reduce I'm trying not to quote Korzybski and map,
Mhm.
try to reduce territory to the map, but um, But yeah, it's super important that when we move in this direction, which has been the dream of modern science, but I think it's not. I think that is a dream that's inherited from monotheistic religious traditions, and that's a dream that is inherited really from this Platonic or Platonistic, or however you want to refer to it, to disambiguate it from necessarily like Plato's own, vision. Because again, yes, Plato has all of these different tensions and tensions within and between dialogues. His corpus is problematic in precisely the way that it needs to be generative. This is another way of talking about the existence of arbitrary variation, say, within an individual, right? That means that there are problems within an individual, and they are the source of the capacity for ongoing adaptive change. Because a kind of, absolute unity, which is a big thing in Plato as well, right? Is a very problematic concept if you want to believe in the kind of reality of any sort of novelty and whatever. And of course, you can read Plato quite readily, and he has been read that way, as all change is appearance. So the world of becoming is the way, very Parmenidean, right? Is opinion, intuition is at odds with intellect, all of that sort of stuff, and that's right here in the Timaeus as well. Um, you can go in that direction. And I think in a lot of ways that's been the major, way that Platonism has been uptaken in the history of Western thought. And that's why, some of us are invested in this inversion of Platonism, right? Even though, again, that inversion is perhaps prefigured in Plato's own works. But so, yeah, if we go in the direction of trying to have complete explanations, and I will have said this many times in discussions with you, but we actually end up in a place where explanation is completely impossible. So not only do we undermine autonomy completely if we remove the numinous autonomy of the other, basically, um, we also undermine explanation if we imagine in a similar way that we could subdue every particular in the world to a single explanatory scheme. And that is what grand unified theories, theories of everything, whatever, that's one way they've been traditionally framed. And that we could talk about this being the Laplacian paradigm in physics, even though it's obviously much older than Laplace and in exactly the way we're describing. But it's just important. Condition of autonomy of one's own autonomy is the autonomy of the other. The condition of explanation of anything is actually the inexplicable remainder. Um,
Mm. Yeah.
we could develop those themes a little bit more if that's obscure the way I'm saying it now, but I think we want we want to plow through. Um, I think one thing we could do is we could look at the section on the chora in the Timaeus. I got a few quotes from that, and then we could dive into the Triton article and the Schelling thing, and I mean obviously there's the Schelling text itself. I mean I don't know how you want to proceed because there's sort of three different texts here, and they're all pretty generative, but
Mhm.
um, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just on what you just said about the nature of explanation, I think the sweet spot is in that third kind, which is what the limited and unlimited have in common. So what what the ideas and materiality share. And, you know, um, that's the that's where theory and myth come together. That's where what we're offering, what Plato was trying to offer is a likely story. This is a probable story. So he's offering a kind of probabilistic um, cosmology here. This is and he's situating himself um, first of all, sort of mm, masked through dialogue partners, but very much, acknowledging the difficulty of this task of coming to explain the father of all of this, or the universe. That's a difficult enough task, but then to try to speak of that
Mm.
source, that creator to normal people is an even more difficult, if not impossible task, right? So there's both just the theorist, the philosopher speculating, and then trying to actually share something about that with non-philosophers, I guess is what he means. Um, and so,
Yeah.
the best we can do here is a probable story. And actually, I think why this dialogue is so valuable and why Schelling wants to read it uh, in a Kantian way is that, you know, Plato is historically situated at this sort of fulcrum point. Obviously, philosophy had begun a few centuries before him, and he's inheriting a long tradition. Um, but it's still young, and Plato has this sort of almost naive confidence in the human mind's ability to make sense of the universe, and a very prescient intuition that mathematics,
Mm,
geometry in particular, was the way to do it. And for Plato, it was actually the movement of the planets through the fixed constellations that taught us
mm.
mathematics, right?
Yeah.
It's not the human that just came up with this, you know,
Yeah.
we actually learned it by paying attention to appearances, but those appearances point beyond themselves to these proportions and these ratios. Um, and so Plato seems to be this example of the human mind still sort of naively confident in its ability to understand not only the origin of the universe, but the origin of the conditions of its own, of the conditions of the possibility of its own knowledge of that universe, right? And so I think Schelling is right that Plato is already transcendental in a way. Um, and I just want to share one line from Whitehead, and then we can dig into just go right into the Cora.
Mm,
This is Adventures. No, this is not Adventures of Ideas. This is Aims of Education. Whitehead says, the creation of the world is the first unconscious act of speculative thought. And the first task of a self-conscious philosophy is to explain how it has been done. And
mm,
so you could say there's a kind of anthropomorphism there, that like the first unconscious act of speculative thought, does he mean of a human being that creates the world? I mean, on some level, from a Kantian point of view, yeah. But from a Platonic point of view, you know, Plato projecting out his, you know, image of the divine as the demiurge is like just the human craftsman, you know, writ large, um, shaping the material, like you know, a potter working with clay. Um, but you know, it's such a crude image on the one hand, but like it's also what we have to work with. And I think the anthropic principle nowadays can be stated in in a variety of very sophisticated ways, but ultimately it's a play on what Plato was doing. Um,
yeah. And it's where we keep coming back to it, and I suppose it is that Copernican uh,
mhm,
revolution slash Kantian Platonic reversion in Kant that it characterizes the history of modern philosophy, the critical philosophy and transcendental philosophy, and even, I mean, we 100% to your point, we're still grappling exactly with that today, and that's part of the criticism of sort of more enactivist thinkers of the free energy principle, but also of science in general, in things like the blind spot. It's there in people who are trying, despite a turn kind of against metaphysics in modern philosophy, partly because everyone is like afraid of being, naive. Um, People who are trying Peirce, Whitehead, Deleuze, nonetheless to be metaphysicians are still all saying, yeah, but we've read Kant, we're in the transcendental lineage, and we're being true in some sense, just as Deleuze sees Kant as an enemy, and you might say he sees Plato as an enemy in a sense as well, or Platonism as an enemy, but it's a generative thing, just as he says, we're going to preserve a lot of Platonism in our process of inverting it and whatever. And it's not only unavoidable, that's a good thing. We should want to do that. I think he has exactly the same relationship with Kant. And obviously he ends up calling his own approach to philosophy transcendental empiricism, right? So no, not no one. I mean, maybe some people are trying to get completely out of that, but I think mostly I don't know, I don't want to say like the great philosophers of the modern era, something pretentious and stupid like that, but this is where we are still, and I guess we will inevitably always be there. And I fully agree that Plato's really prescient, and I love Schelling's reading. Both there are two aspects of Schelling's reading, right? In that, the Triton article, he does highlight the Kantian aspect, but then he's really focuses more on the kind of, the chora as generative and the inversion of Neoplatonism and all of that. Whereas I think the excerpts from the Timaeus essay that are in this are actually are focused less on the chora and more on that Kantian reading of Plato as I don't think he wants to say, I jokingly said to you, oh, it's great how Schelling reveals what a question-begging subjectivist Plato in fact was. I'm just joking. Like that's not really what he's saying, but he is saying that, yeah, in this mythopoetic language, Plato is making a transcendental argument, even though he's not, of course, explicitly saying that. And just again, before we jump into the Cora, just a couple of things that riff off what you were saying. Oh yeah, Schelling quotes right at the beginning, from near the beginning of the Timaeus. Exactly what you said. To discover the poet and father of all this, father sick. Maybe we'll get to that. Of all this is quite a task, and even if one discovered him, to speak of him to all men, so
Mhm.
is impossible. Okay, so that also is one of the beginnings of the esoteric readings of Platonism as well, right? But I mean, again, Plato is in that context already. He's in a society in which mystery cults, like the mystery cults of the deities of Samothrace and all of that, are. By the way, have you been to the Louvre and have you seen that winged victory sculpture? So there's this
I've seen the
Samothrace.
image, but yeah, I haven't been to Paris yet, actually.
It's like when one of the times when I was there, it's moved around, but it's in like one of the big. There are these huge foyers and staircases of marble and stuff in the Louvre. And then on one occasion when I was there, the Winged Victory. I don't know if it's Samothrace or Samothrace. I've heard it, different. It doesn't matter. But it was like over the top of this whole foyer, and it's like it doesn't have a head, right? But it's this incredibly. I think it's probably all the more imposing for being headless. This huge winged figure. Anyway, I digress. The other thing, which I think you're right, Plato has this sort of you're sort of characterizing it as a naivety that he thinks that the human mind can potentially, have this complete vision. And despite all of the things that I said, I'm actually trying to preserve that naivety, right? But I'm saying that knowing and this again is the transcendental move to some extent, right? Knowing the limits of our capacity to understand, to explain, to subdue, to the rational analytic, etc., is a condition of maintaining the naivety of believing we can have explanations at all. Because in the Laplacian scheme, you can't explain anything, right? All explain. It's like, why do we have, structure and complexity and an arrow of time and all of this stuff? None of that seems to be there in the equations of motion. Why do we have it? Oh, well, the initial conditions were special.
Right.
That's called the past hypothesis, right? The philosopher of physics, David Albert calls it the past hypothesis. That's just Mysterianism. That's just the unmoved mover in a different way, and obviously it's deeply bound up with theology. And this is hardly, I mean, a particular brand of theology, a particular modern brand of theology. And that's hardly surprising, right? I mean, guys like Laplace, Newton, obviously, but also the early developers of probability theory, which is Laplace, but also even before him, Bernoulli and all of that. They just assumed that, okay, if mathematics applies, like if you can get good mathematical descriptions and explanations of the world, then that entails determinism. And that means that in their development of probability theory, it was always already an epistemic notion. It was always already the only reason there's chance or probability in the cosmos is because we're limited human beings and we can't see it all. Of course, the deity, which
Right.
they just took for granted, was sitting outside and can see everything, and there's no probability, there's no chance, there's no whatever from that perspective. And
And this is why the Platonic cosmology is so different from the way most Christian cosmologies panned out, is because Plato doesn't he's not offering a curatio ex nihilo story here. Matter is there already. Matter is eternal, right? And so that limits any God trick or considering God to be uh, capable of complete control and domination over the creation.
but that's the whole point of necessity, right? That's what
Yeah.
it's. cannot be subdued by the intellect. Therefore, it cannot be subdued by God. Like, but yeah, he says also, just to again resonate with the thing that you were saying, um, right at the beginning. So main section two of the Timaeus is the work of necessity, which is about the chora, and which I want to read a bunch of quotes from, but I'll just read this one and then I'll hand over to you again because I've talked for ages. But um, and this is just to reinforce something you were saying, but in Plato's words, it is not for us to state the principle or principles of all things or whatever seems to be true of them, if for no other reason than because it's difficult to set forth one's views according to the present manner of exposition. Blah, blah, blah. You must not expect such an account from me, nor could I persuade myself that I would be the right one to undertake such a task or a task of such magnitude. I shall stick to the value of the likely accounts. Mine will be no less likely than another man's, but rather more so. Okay, there's a bit of hubris there. But so, and then he says the thing that I quoted. So let us begin again. We're going to begin again, and now we're going to start with the new first, which is the chora. Um, Calling also now at the beginning of our speech on a savior God, because he's already done that. Like he said, did that right at the beginning as well. But this time to see us safely through a strange and unusual argument to a likely conclusion. And I know I already quoted that, but I just like it so much. It's just,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So, in this first attempt, when the receptacle is still off stage, backstage, we're given this series of dualisms.
Yeah.
Being, becoming, uh, intellect and opinion, the sensible and intelligible, form and matter. And Schelling will translate this into Kantian terms like ideas and intuitions and so on. And it's
Understanding,
what's that?
understanding and sensibility. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's only now beginning again to have another attempt at this that there's an acknowledgement of the need for a third that mediates, that
Mm,
shows that which the two um, halves of this dualism have in common.
mm,
And, you know, darkness, difficulty have been of words that we've already mentioned. Plato uses, it's a obscure and dim are words that come up, I think, in the passage just
mm,
below what you were just reading. Um, and while you were highlighting the patriarchal language in considering the creator of the universe as a father, but it's like obvious if you're going to use that gendered term, fathers don't create anything by themselves. And so the receptacle is described as the nurse, the wet nurse of all
mm,
becoming. And so, and matter and materiality, though I think the reason Schelling really emphasizes that term, he explicitly says, is because of its etymological resonance with mother and the maternal aspect. And so there is that other side added. So while there's the typical male-centric view of the divine in that comment about the father of all things as the origin, there's later the mother as well. And so Plato is at least acknowledging the need for a kind of gender balance in the creation here. What's interesting though is that later that patriarchal bias will reappear. I'm, there are going to be viewers who are going to be pissed because, like, I don't know, there's one guy, I even mentioned politics at the last beginning of the last video and he was freaking out. But anyways, this is an important, I think, cultural element at play here because our images of man and woman and sexuality are very relevant to how we imagine the genesis of the universe. Because
yeah.
again, we can't help but be anthropic here in
Yeah.
our attempts to imagine how this happens. And um, but in the Timaeus later, when he's getting more into the details of where did the sex differentiation come from? And basically describes women, I think, as men reborn, uh, uh, men who lacked courage in one life get reborn as women, and that's why. So women are kind of like degraded men in
Mm,
Plato's story, and this is his quasi, or maybe should I say quasi or pseudo evolutionary? It's he's trying to give us an account of his process of historical genesis here, um, and it's unfortunate that the patriarchal bias comes out so strongly here, but he is at
mm,
least acknowledging the need for the maternal principle alongside the paternal principle. Um, and also, just one more thing in his defense at the beginning of Timaeus, just a few lines in, he says, in a very quick summary of the Republic, he reminds uh, his readers in the Timaeus that women can be guardians too, women can be philosophers too. So there's at least, he's trying his best. For his time, I think it's a pretty progressive attempt to integrate women back in, but and the feminine. Not that those are the same thing, but um,
Yeah. Well, I think one, we've talked about this before as well when we were talking about the problem of the fourth, or maybe it was in Answer to Job. But what I really like here is that the turn that, or the inversion perhaps, that Schelling, he's at least moving very strongly in the direction of, to the vision of the self-organizing, self-creating, you know, self-rationalizing in some sense, matter doing it for itself. The generative, the core as a generative principle is that, the biological correlate of this is, of course, parthenogenesis, which
mm,
is literally virgin birth. So there are
mm,
interesting resonances there, perhaps. But female members of various species being able to, generate offspring on their own without the need for a male. So this is a thing that it's not that uncommon in nature. And there are all sorts of, crazy things going on with, sort of sex roles in nature, of course, and lots of hermaphroditic organisms and lots of sex changes that happen at different periods in life in response to various cues, and all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff going on there. But parthenogenesis is amongst those things. And so all this is to say is that, the feminine principle can at least sometimes do it all on its own. The masculine principle can never do that. Uh,
right. Yeah.
not
And
having a womb is a bit of an issue
and it's
there.
interesting how often Christian Platonists would read the world soul in a Marian way. And if you connect that to what Schelling is doing here, the virgin birth is in some sense intellect coming out of matter instead of matter,
Mm,
that the demiurge is creating everything, as most readings of Genesis would have it. Instead, there's this inversion where that miracle of immaculate conception becomes cosmic. Um, though, the point would be to understand materiality in a way that it wouldn't be a miracle. That's sort of mm, just a deeper understanding of what this uh, unruly motion or
mm,
this yeah, the not this chaotic movement can produce. Um, yeah, I so the world soul uh, is in some ways it's obviously distinct from the Cora, but in some ways it's as though, and Schelling highlights this too, the Cora is already ensouled in some sense, and Schelling argues in I was rereading this is great. There's a chapter in Bruce Matthews' book, Schelling's Organic Form of Philosophy, on the Timaeus, and
mm,
elsewhere in that commentary, which unfortunately we only have excerpts of that in that other Schelling reader that we were looking at. Um, but he talks about how Schelling is uh, recognizing how it's not just that he's inverting Plotinus so that matter is co-eternal with the one, but he's also saying that the soul, the world's soul, is um, prior to the intellect. That, in other words, Schelling argues you can have soul without intellect, but you can't have intellect without soul.
mm,
And so
mm,
it's his privileging again of um, the lower over the higher, in at least the way that the emanationist scheme orders these things. Um, but I've always had a sense that, Plato intends us to see some connection between the Cora and the world soul. And it's almost as though because the world soul is also a mediator between the sensible and the intelligible. It's, the world soul, or the principle of life and self movement, is
Mm,
the organic principle, in other words,
mm,
is somehow an integration of the idea with the material.
mm,
And like and this connects right to Kant's third critique too. We can only understand organisms as self-caused, as though there's an idea at work, uh, forming the organism, such that the whole seems to precede the parts. And yet every organism is also incomplete, right? And so it's as though um, every living being, aside from the cosmic animal, at least, which would be complete in Plato's view, um,
mm,
every living being, every finite organism modeled on that cosmic organism is like a unique proportion or mixture of the limited and the unlimited, but not a
mm,
perfect mixture. Only the world soul, only the cosmic animal has a perfect mixture and is therefore immortal, or
mm,
at least a moving image of eternity, but everlasting in some sense. But we finite creatures are not a perfect proportion. We're incomplete. Um, every organism has some degree of beauty, Plato would say, where, beauty is associated with this proportion between the limited and the unlimited,
mm,
um, but not the complete beauty of the cosmic organism,
mm,
right? And so there's this sense of the soul, I think, even already in Plato, uh, as a almost a higher principle than the nous or the intellect, in that it establishes this harmony. Um, and Plato and Schelling really picks up on that by explicitly giving it priority over the nous, right? In addition to the receptacle getting priority.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is not where I want to go because I want to go into the Cora stuff in the Timaeus and then into the
Mm.
Schelling thing. But where beauty and also the good, capital G good, are identified with completeness, so the complete beauty or the complete good, or with unity, right?
Yeah.
Return to the one in the Platonic scheme. I mean, there's also an interesting way, and we don't have the one is we need to wait for the Parmenides to, that dialogue to resolve issues that I mean, I don't know if we know about the actual chronology of the dialogues there, but it seems to resolve certain issues in the theory or criticize, not necessarily resolve issues in the theory of forms, including as they appear in the Timaeus, and then we get the notion of the one developed. And then there's, the one as, the one in itself versus the one in being, there's all this different stuff. And I think there's cool, interesting ways, and we've talked about this before as well, but where the one and the chora actually can be kind of synonymized in an important sense. And that's probably the end of the trajectory that Schelling is pointing to as well. Um, but I think of course, immediately find it problematic to identify beauty or the good with completeness or unity, right? Because again, to me, completeness is death, and unity is kind of boring. It's unproblematic, and so even in the Triton article, there's a lot of talk about again, Neoplatonic conceptions of unity as the good, and really the discord as the bad in some sense, or the evil, right? And I really don't think that is a good way of seeing things, to be honest. And I think that it's the discord both within and without that it's again the substrate or the precondition of generative adaptivity and things like that,
Yeah.
and it has
And
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is where Schelling and Whitehead, with their emphasis on process and incompleteness,
Yeah.
I think find a better balance than Plato, who I think, in affirming the completeness and the immortality of the world soul, um, it's a premature closure on, and it's not evolutionary. We need the
Yeah.
whole of the cosmos to be in open-ended genesis, and like to really emphasize that cosmogenesis is ongoing. It's not finished. And Plato was too quick, I think, to consider the cosmos a finished product. right? Rather
Yeah.
than still being in process.
That's also why I don't, even though I know you like this phrase, I mean, I like the phrase, it's quite, felicitous, but I don't really like the notion of the cosmos as a moving image of eternity, right? Because I think
Mm.
that goes with a lot of this stuff. And in fact, that is the Laplacian image.
Sure.
So we see all this movement. I mean, again, it's very classically Platonic or even Parmenidean or whatever. We see all this movement, but in fact, nothing is really changing. Um,
Yeah.
it's all there eternally. This is the fundamental positive of determinism. Well, you either have a situation, right, where there was change in some other epoch, and then all the change was exhausted at a certain point, which we see as the initial conditions of our epoch. And then from henceforth, it was deterministic. And then you, of course, are just at a loss to say why all the degrees of freedom were saturated. If there were degrees of freedom, how come they're completely saturated? There's no way of explaining that. That's just a posit that we take. Or it's a hard eternalism where that set of affairs, that arrangement, that quantity of information, blah, 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 is constant for all time. And the cosmos, as we experience it, is literally a moving image of eternity. And yeah, I don't really like that idea.
Yeah. I think if we have if eternity is imagined as something static and not living, then yeah, I mean, it's such a
Just highlight that really quickly because Plato wants it to be both static and living, and this I don't get. This is a paradox.
yeah.
Because yes, the wandering cause, right? The chora, what is it? The wandering cause and how its nature is to cause motion, right? So matter and the kind of fallen world in the two worlds view of
Mm.
Plato is the chora is animacy, right? Is movement and is life. But then at the same time, the forms maybe or maybe not, but certainly the intellect, demiurge and paradigm and whatever, those are living gods, but they're also static. And to me, that's a problem, right? I mean, paradox is fun, but how is the thing alive and static?
Right. Yeah. I mean, we still have this terrestrial celestial divide in Plato. And, if we can credit Newton with any important cosmological insights, I mean, obviously his physical and scientific insights are
Yeah.
very significant. But in terms of a lasting cosmological contribution, bringing the terrestrial and the celestial together, um, erasing the difference between the two. Am I losing you? You seem to be freezing on my end. Are you there?
Okay.
Did I lose you?
Okay. We back?
Back.
Just for a second. Yeah. We're back. All right. Fingers
Okay.
crossed.
Um, but yeah, I was saying one of Newton's major contributions is to eliminate the terrestrial celestial, you know,
Yeah.
difference. It's one cosmos, and the same principles and laws that are at play on the Earth are also at play elsewhere. And I think in that ancient cosmological vision, this idea of the planets and the stars as being, made of a different substance, a kind of etheric or um, non corruptible substance. I think, yeah, that's one of those whole unscientific holdovers that obviously doesn't survive in a contemporary reading of Plato. Um, but what's interesting about what Newton did is it's very much a hermetic move still to as above so below. It's
Yeah.
making good on the pursuit of a more universal set of principles that doesn't need to be bifurcated in above and below anymore.
And what he gives us is literally a moving image of eternity because his cosmos is an eternalist.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know.
so you get the traditional Platonism in Newton quite clearly, but you lose the life and motion and the ensouled understanding of nature as a generative process.
Well, I want to get there because I want to get to the way necessity. I mean, we already hinted at it, but kind of gets bastardized, like the
Mm,
Platonic kind of necessity gets bastardized in kind of modern theology and modern physics, which are like this. Again, we have to say there's two sides of the same coin. Uh, oh, I mean, I also you were making me want to jump into a little critique of Hans Jonas and just in terms of kind of moving towards continuity theses is a really important part of the progress of modern thought, I think. And in a way, if Kant gives us a Platonic reversion, in fact, contemporary science gives us a pre-Platonic reversion in a sense, because that's what, the physiologoi and, the Ionian natural philosophers and stuff were in that empiricist place where they were trying to think of everything as continuous in a sense. And Plato, to some degree, is shutting that down. And different readings of Plato, he's either incorporating it or he's shutting it down, depending on again a matter of emphasis in how you read his corpus. But Hans Jonas, and I think we're going to do some episodes on Jonas maybe in the future, because he's just so commonly referenced by inactivists and as having this really, really potent critique of things, again, like the free energy principle and all of that. But the thing about Jonas is, aside from his, which I know you take issue with, critiques of Whitehead, which are also based on precisely the fact that Whitehead seems to collapse the distinction between the living and the non-living for Jonas. The way Jonas images, pictures, depicts physics is just the received view. So in fact, Jonas really depicts physics in terms of the mechanical philosophy, even though he says some suggestible things about, the whole of the cosmos being organic and that sort of stuff. Really, he really wants to preserve the hard cut between life and non-life. And so I think he partakes of or makes use of the received view in maintaining that, rather than actually looking for a more evolutionary point of view, which is a continuity thesis which extends beyond life and of course doesn't elide the fact that life is different from non-life, and we have an explanatory burden in Origins of Life, etc., to account for that if we can. Again, without necessarily explaining all the particulars of the origins of life, but at least in giving a principled account of how that can happen. And of course, there's tons of fascinating work in exactly that regard. So a continuity thesis will not collapse life into non-life and will not remove that explanatory burden that we have there of trying to explain that cusp, but it will make it possible to explain that emergence. In fact, it will not make life miraculous. Just as the generative chora and taking generative chora first means that evolution, self-organization, all of that becomes kind of non-miraculous in a sense as well. Again, it's one thing to take this as a basic principle and another thing to have a very, a more detailed but also principled account of how it works. But that is the history also, that's part of the history of modern science, which is again kind of a minority report in terms of the overarching paradigms, but it's everything from, I mean, maybe I'm just trying to shoehorn this in, but everything from the influence of, the emerging science of embryology and anatomy on Kant himself and on the first critique, which is already heavily, moving in an organicist direction, but slightly cryptically. But reason as an organism, again, that's a Platonic reversion, but also under the influence of the nascent science of biology, but through to Darwin having a huge influence on the development of statistical mechanics through Boltzmann. And the way, I think David Krakauer, the president of the SFI, gets it right when he talks about the prehistory of complexity science is in fact about the development of a post-evolutionary physics. So this is about the influence that biology has on physics, and that is all about moving us out of the eternalist paradigm in some sense, right? And into a generative, constructive paradigm in which the process of evolution, which is very apparent to us, is a kind of trivially true, observable fact about things, is not explained away, but is given. I guess a certain pride of place, I might say, but is given its due as a genuinely creative process, not just an appearance. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, should we jump into the finally into the Quora? Or do you want to respond to that stuff?
Yeah. Uh, yeah, let's go there. Just to say, that's a neat just connection between the canceling the terrestrial and celestial difference and having some continuum there versus the life non-life issue. I think we want a continuum there, but also to acknowledge the creative emergence and the difference, but it's a difference in degree, I would say, instead of kind. Would be one way to
Yeah,
put
I
it.
mean, I think if we're moving in this Schellingian direction, which we're now finally going to discuss via a few choice quotes about the Chora from the Timaeus itself, then we're moving in a direction that I rhetorically, and to just piss everybody off, refer to as like vitalist animism. We're saying that, there's fundamentally a kind of vital process at the fount of all things. And then animism is the relational component of that, and that relates to what we're talking about, the numinosity, the autonomous nature of the other, and all of that. That's all about animism, that I cannot subdue the other to myself, but I am reciprocally, interdependently transformed in my relation with that numinous other. And to me, that's just such a beautiful way of bringing together a lot of the kinds of concerns that you and I share, whether that's everything from kind of contemplative experiences of the numinous, with or without psychedelics and things like that. So from a phenomenological aspect, all the way through to really understanding the genesis, the ontogenesis of a world in which those kinds of experiences are possible, but also in which the endless forms most beautiful are possible and are not just mere appearances. And to me, again, this is not actually my fundamental desideratum in some sense, but because I don't feel like I'm particularly threatened by nihilism personally, because I'm just like, whoa, I'm more like overwhelmed all the time by how incredible the world is in its diversity, by the way, in its non-unity, in its multiplicity, in its incompleteness. That's what's continually blowing me away. And of course, it's terrifying all the time to encounter one's own ignorance in the face of that, because, like, to the extent that one's open to the otherness. So, it's like not only the unconscious in this Jungian sense that we talked about at the beginning is like Kabiri-like and autonomous and numinous and all that. It's just like the world is just like that. That's the way the whole world is. That's the way the people we relate to are. That's how I kind of feel like we should treat our children. And maybe that'll also get us later to a discussion in this. I don't think we're doing 90 minutes, by the way, but a discussion in we can stop whenever we need to, but in this of Schelling, at least according to Tritton, preserving, despite his inversion of the order of emanationism. So he inverts emanationism to a more of an emergentism, but he still preserves the kind of superiority of the effect over the cause and stuff like that. And I don't think that's quite the way I would want to put it either, but we'll get there. Okay. I know
Yeah.
I'm talking too much, but Cora, let's just jump in. I
Can
will
I
just
just say, and then you don't respond to this unless you need to, but Schelling is an emergentist, but it's the kind of emergentism that makes sense where, he would say mind and life are already implicit in matter, right? Matter was never unformed, matter was never dead, matter was never lacking what we experience as intelligence in our consciousness. So yeah, just wanted to throw that in there.
And I think that you're absolutely right too, and I agree that that is the case. Again, you and I quibble a lot over how we generalize certain categories, but of course,
Vitalism's fine with me. I'm happy to
yeah, yeah,
affirm
yeah. And
emergent vitalist emergentism or emergent vitalism, whatever. Yeah.
something of that nature, and this is the sense in which what's his face, Galen Strawson is, you know, gesturing at something correct when he says that naturalism or physicalism entails panpsychism. It's just that no, I don't agree with it phrased in that way, but it and I also think it's a purely rhetorical point in the sense that yes, obviously, like if you have a monist conception, and you don't admit of miracles, so if you're broadly speaking naturalist, and we don't want to equate the mechanical philosophy with naturalism exactly. Actually, we want it to be more like natureism, or biologism, or and that is going to be a vitalist animist picture. Then yeah, of course, vitality and mindedness and all of that must be prefigured. It just the problem with some panpsychisms is that they project the thing, appear to project the thing whole hog into the fundament, and it's like, no, that's an anti-emergentism. So we don't want to be anti-emergentism, but we don't want an emergentism of like miracles, miraculous emergence. Okay, I will just read a couple of things about the Quora, and then I'll stop again before I'll let you lead us into the Schelling stuff. But yeah, I mean, there's heaps of stuff, obviously. It's a kind that's difficult and obscure. It's the nurse of all becoming. We've said that. It's the wandering cause, just to emphasize that again. Its nature is to cause motion. Um, Okay, there's all this stuff about it having no definite character of its own. And because it's a natural receptacle of all bodies, it can always be called the same because it never alters its character. That's kind of a way of reinserting eternity into movement as well. Like this thing is moving, but it's always the same because it has no character of its own. So therefore, its character never alters. I just want to plant a flag at that point because I do have some obviously this will go into Aristotle and his notion of matter and it having no character of its own, but being this passive thing that's ready to receive the imprint in the hylomorphic scheme. And I think it will also go into Whitehead and creativity, the nature of creativity in Whitehead. And I just I don't want to give my full critical argument of that at the moment, but I do think well, I basically think if you don't have a quasi either proto or post hylomorphic scheme, you don't actually need the chora or whatever, the substrate, to be characterless. Because the whole point of the thing being characterless is that it can take anything that is to receive it in itself, every kind of character must be devoid of all character. Keywords are receive and every, but to receive. So outside the model of receipt, or participation, basically, the participatory two worlds model, you don't need a characterless substrate per se. The substrate's character is actually reflected is present in everything. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have a character of its own. It only needs to be characterless if all of the things that it is going to receive are saturated with character, and so it needs to be a blank canvas in order to receive them with high fidelity. And that is the hylomorphic model. And Simondon is really lovely on this in talking about the prepared material. So in actually going into the technical schema, that which is the potter and the clay, or the stamping of the mold, the form onto the clay, and he talks about the prepared homogeneity of the material, right? So the clay is prepared, all of it, the dirt and grit and rocks and everything are removed, and it's stirred up in a way that renders it basically colloidal, which means that all of its constituent components are kind of equally spaced and ready to internally transfer forces evenly amongst themselves, such that they can evenly take the imprint of the form. That's obviously very important in molding, in that technical operation that the hylomorphic schema is derived from. But I don't think that's a good basis for thinking about reality because I don't have a two-world scheme already. And I think without it, I am now giving my whole critique, evidently. Without having that two-world scheme, I'm like, yeah, you don't need the chora to be characterless. You only need that because you've already posited the two-world scheme.
Yeah.
But the last couple of things, actually, no, you go, because I want to
Well, I
read.
just on that, I think there might be some holomorphism there. It's interesting that Tyler Triton talks about the Aristotelian reading of Plato becoming the dominant understanding
Yeah,
of Plato,
yeah.
and that there's something else going on in the receptacle that Aristotle's Hule doesn't capture. But characterless, I think what I think Plato's getting at there is that the receptacle itself he is distinct from the elements,
Hmm.
and the elements are the ways that the receptacle becomes characterized initially. Um, and the elements are sensible. The receptacle is not sensible. And it has a kind of movement intrinsic to it, but it's almost like we have to describe that movement as a incorporeal movement. It's not the movement of bodies in space. It's like the vibration of space itself, if you want. Um,
Yeah. is it we can you can go Aristotelian again, and there's the kind of dunamis, energeia, kinesis
Mhm.
relationship there. And I think the thing just to point out is that the movement is not kinetic in the
Yes.
sense that for Aristotle, kinesis is movement towards a specific end or like in a direction. Like so extensive movement is
Right.
moving, going somewhere. And the movement of the chora, you could say, because it's chaotic, it's and this is kind of like the colloidal clay in a sense. They're all equal in some sense, all the elements. The movement in the chora is going every which way in equal proportion, so it's not going anywhere, right?
Right.
Something like that, yeah.
And then the other thing just about participation, I know Tritton says that Schelling's reading is not participatory because it's getting rid of the, imitation of the model
Yeah,
scheme.
yeah, yeah.
But in I think what's happening in Schelling and in Whitehead is not that participation is eliminated, is that it's inverted. And so rather than actual physical beings gaining their reality by participation in the forms gain their reality by participation in the physical things, in actual occasions.
Isn't that Aristotle? That's Aristotelian, surely.
Well, it is more Aristotelian, um, except that the the substrate
Characterful.
isn't what?
Characterful in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's definitely still, inheriting a Platonic and generally Aristotelian way of thinking. But I mean, it's a preservation of participation, um, inverted in a similar way that Aristotle is understood to have inverted Plato. That's fair. Yeah, I think so. But it's also, um, mm, I'm trying to find the words to describe like what Schelling and Whitehead are adding that isn't already in Aristotle. Maybe I'll think of something to say about that. But I noticed that, you know, Triton was referring to Schelling's move as like uh anti-participatory or something, and I feel like, well, it's you can invert the what gets emphasized in participation as, what's gaining reality from what. You can flip that around, or what's gaining actuality from what. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, maybe
I
we'll.
think Yeah, I mean, one of my key desiderata, as you know, is that I want actual and virtual to be operational terms rather than substantial terms, right? So
Mhm.
to really get out of the two world scheme, I want to say that there's the one world, and so that the Cora equivalent is in fact the primordial actuality, and so I don't then I feel like I can dispense with the primordial nature of God and other things as well, right? By um, I mean, yeah, I'm collapsing some. I'm trying to make a leaner scheme and see if I can achieve the same stuff. And I
And
would, of course, not deny that there is a participatory mode, because indeed, hylomorphism occurs, because it is based on an actual technical operation. So that kind of design and imbuing of a but this could take us far afield into a critique of people like Bernard Stiegler's notion of technicity and all of that, where he is talking about, organized matter being what a technical object is, and the human takes the unorganized matter and organizes it. And of course, you and I would then very much agree that there is no unorganized matter, what it is in a sense. But so what it is to be actual is to have at least some incipient kind of organization, right? Because otherwise you need two worlds, because you
right,
can't go from complete lack of organization to, and that's why I will go with Simondon in many ways, although in my in my discussions with real Simondon scholars, I'm pushing a certain thing, so maybe it's an eisegetical reading of Simondon as well. But there is some character to the pre-individual, or it's a pre-definite character, but it's best thought of in terms of, gradients, and it's best thought of in terms of flux, and a flux that actually can, though, create gradients. So, and then, I like this, of course, because it's gonna take us into those domains of actual empirical modern science explored in the development of non-equilibrium systems thinking, and the way that feeds back onto quantum mechanics, and all of that. That's where I'm kind of going with all of this stuff. In a obviously speculative register. I'm not saying that I can get all that Whitehead achieves, or all that Schelling achieves, or whatever, or Plato, much less, in this way. But that's the direction I want to move. So it's moving in Schelling's direction, which we're going to get to, but taking it even further, or moving in the direction where the next thing I'll read will be from the section in the Timaeus on the nature of the chora in more detail, on the chaotic nature of the chora. But yeah.
Yeah, let's go on
Okay.
and those. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think we've said a bunch about the basic properties of the chora, and then, so section 20 of the Timaeus is description of the primitive chaos. So, as there was no homogeneity or balance in the forces that filled it, no part of it was in equilibrium. Okay, this is a translation, right? But yeah, it's a far from equilibrium system in and of itself. It swayed unevenly in every direction as it was shaken by the forces, and being moved, it in turn shook them. And then it's important that he also says, I'm skipping over a bit that I'm going to come back to, my favorite bit, but he also says, shaken by the receptacle, which itself being moved acted as a kind of shaking implement. So I think the movement is really all immanent to the receptacle, but it's kind of like one part of it is shaking another in some sense. So it's kind of got a feedback thing that's happening there. It's moved and moving at the same time, right? Which is the kind of recursivity you're going to require of a self-organizing principle, that it can have, in Simondonian terms, a disparity in it, where a primitive or incipient relation can emerge. And thus you could say that this ill-defined region here is the source of an energetic gradient or whatever that is driving this side over here, but then there's a reciprocal driving, and blah blah blah. So he says, um, the things that were moved I mean, okay, whatever, what are these things? But were constantly being separated and carried in different directions, rather like the contents of a winnowing basket, or a similar implement for cleaning corn. Now, what I really just love here is that the winnowing basket, so if people have heard of coarse graining, as a either an epistemic or a construct. If you've listened to us, you might have heard about it as a constructive generative principle, and not that we're the only ones saying that. Whitehead in symbolism, that we always like to quote, nature abstracting itself and all of that, is that he's not saying coarse graining though. But coarse graining, where we get that term for that metaphor, is from the winnowing basket, right? So the winnowing basket is, you have the grain, and you're separating the wheat from the chaff, or the kernels of the corn from the chaff, or whatever, and you're separating by density. So the kernel sinking by density, and also size, because it's also like a sieve. So hence coarse graining. And so basically the application of motion in the presence of a matrix. So he does also say, what does he say? It's by nature a matrix. So, there's a way that we could pick on that and say there's a smuggling of predefiniteness in here or something, but again, these are all metaphors. But in a literal winnowing basket, there is motion and a matrix. But even without the sieve aspect, even without the matrix, there is a separation by density of the elements. And I guess to go really fully relational here, in terms of relations being prior to their terms, you want to say that it's not pre-formed parts of distinct density, but that the shaking and movement itself is in fact causing a kind of, it's just like a precipitation almost of dense elements from what was previously mixed. And of course, you can go to the actual processes of precipitation to see the exact sort of things coming like happening, the precipitation of a definite substance out of what was previously a more or less homogeneous mixture. That's what it is to be soluble, and that's what it is to precipitate something that is soluble. So I love these images, right? Because they're just it's like they're yeah, again, what are the thought forms that we have today that are not presaged in this bloody dialogue?
Right.
Before that time, oh yeah, so the shaking separates the kinds most unlike each other furthest away from each other. Okay, that's just what we've just described in a sense. Um,
And these are the
push.
elements, by the way. I mean, you're asking like, what are these things?
Oh
These
yeah,
are
yeah. Well, they
elements.
will be though. They will be though.
You're right. They're being made. Yeah, yeah. And this is an account. Why Whitehead loves this so much is because it's showing the way that the environment and the entities in that environment are creating each other. And
Yeah, yeah.
so this winnowing process is an organizing process. And this is all happening without the help of the ideas, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So when I said, and the things, what are these things? I was foreshadowing, but also saying there is a way that if we were really going to pick this apart, it sort of slightly, because I'm thinking of certain people I know who are very critical of self-organization as a generative principle and whatever, and they might watch this and then will, I don't want to be seen to be fully begging the question along with Plato here, but in a way seems like it presupposes the things, but it's a dark and difficult idea, right? Although again, we can see the analog of this operation in a lot of physical domains that are empirically accessible and also, formally modelable in particularly the history of 20th century science. But anyway, yeah, so they were separated and they become the elements. Pushed those most like each other towards the same place, with the result that they came to occupy the most like the like and the unlike came to occupy different regions of space even before they were arranged into an ordered universe. So they're already ordered, but before they were ordered in the more organic sense or by
In the
intellect.
best possible way. Before they were ordered in the best possible way, they were already proportionate in some sense.
So there's a sense here of incipient order then. And so again, if we're moving in the Schellingian direction, that can be the seed, that's the grit in the oyster, that the best possible order. So the good then is achieved, not presupposed.
Mm.
Sorry, Hans Jonas, by the way.
Mm.
Because anyway, he has a way that he thinks about the good. Um,
Yeah, yeah. We'll come back to that because Triton makes a big deal about that in his reading of
yeah.
Schumann's Proclus later.
So
Yeah.
before that time, before they were in the ordered universe, before they became the ordered universe, that time they were all without proportion or measure. Fire, water, earth, and air bore some traces of their proper nature, but were entirely in the state to be expected of anything from which God is absent. But the elements here, they are again incipiently present prior to the intellect, prior to God. And then he goes on, like when God gets going, his first step is to shape them completely according to forms and numbers. So I guess that's kind of the origin of the extensive ordered universe. But yeah, I really, really like that passage. Now, I think one of the interesting things is that at a number of places in Plato's dialogues, Socrates will satirize some pre-Socratic or another, right? And here there is a place, oh yeah, a couple of pages before, um, indeed, where he's talking about the characterless nature of the chora, it's going to receive properly and repeatedly all the likenesses of the intelligible and eternal things, so it must in its nature itself be devoid of all character. So let's not say that the mother and receptacle, blah blah blah, is either earth or air or fire or water. So any pre-Socratic, Thales, Heraclitus, etc., who is saying that it is, one of these elements is fundamental, although of course Plato gets the scheme of the four elements from Empedocles. Um, but any of them who say that one of them is fundamental, that's wrong. But we shall not be wrong if we describe it as an invisible and formless kind, receptive of all, possessing in a most puzzling way of intelligibility and extremely hard to grasp. So he's here, I would say, kind of affirming Anaximander, right? He's affirming the apeiron as a good description of the nature of the fundamental substance or substrate or whatever, the chora. Although elsewhere he does have Socrates, I can't remember where now, maybe you will remember, but specifically satirize Anaximander for thinking that basically that matter can do it itself. So there is some, if you connect this description that I just read about the primitive chaos and self-organization and all of that, like beautiful description and better than anything we're going to find in an extant fragment from Anaximander, I think. Um, but there is some suggestion, I know some scholars of Plato have suggested that this is nonetheless, in fact, a satire. So whether or not he's really proposing this as a primordial generative principle, or he's satirizing, or in fact it's a bit of both, which we prefer, right? And he's leaving it open to the reader to interpret that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a dramatization of ideas.
Yeah.
And, I like the reading that I see Schelling attempting where uh, this, vibratory activity of the receptacle is functioning so as to, you know, draw intelligence toward it. It is attractive to the intelligence. It functions as a kind of attractor, drawing intelligence into it. And this is a likely story, right? This is part myth. And so, these are characters involved in a drama. And when we try to think in a more rigorously scientific or theoretical way, we don't need to separate the demiurge from this mirror-like receptacle that it's falling in love with. But we can see how what Plato's trying to describe is like nature reaching up towards the realm of ideas and the ideas reaching down toward the realm of nature. And he's working with um the materials he has at hand in a sense. And you can't, for Plato as much as for Newton, to even think about beginning to understand the universe without making reference to God is absurd, you
Yeah,
know.
of course.
And so he wants matter to be able to do as much as it can do. He's pushing that, um, the autonomy of materiality as far as he can, but there's ultimately still going to be a role for the nous, for reason, for the demiurge, to play here. And I think this is where it gets transcendental, right? Because he's trying, unlike maybe the physiologoi, he wants to again include the conditions of possibility of his own knowing of all of this in the picture, you know?
Yeah,
Uh,
he's just not explicit about that, and we shouldn't expect him to be, sure. And that is what Schelling's drawing out. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, there's the whole dialogue, every dialogue is full of implicit, secret messages and this and that. So but
No, makes it. That's why Whitehead's quote is apt, or that's why it could be. It's why we live in such a world that a philosopher like Whitehead could have said such a thing. These dialogues are so endlessly generative because of their internal tensions and ambiguities, which again is an image of the pre-individual, the tensed, problematic, many one, which is at odds with itself. And thus the emergence of the definite states, the definite individuals, the elements in this case, as resolutions of internal problematics, like
yeah,
Simondon wants to make all of his own philosophical writings an instantiation of the individuation process. He's like, this has to be in the way the ideas are explicated and everything. And I mean, Plato's obviously the master of doing that. But the Simondonian view, right, or again the kind of maybe I mean, at least the way I'm reading Simondon, not a Simondon scholar or a scholar of anything, maybe like, molecular evolution of toxin encoding genes or something, but none of this stuff. Is that that reaching towards that you've just described is imminent, in the sense that the fundamental disparity, the kind of gradient that is set, the separation that's happening from this shaking and all of that to go back and forth between Plato and Simondon, is then what enables the reaching towards. And the reaching towards for Simondon is the establishment of the transductive operation of community, 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 communication between orders of magnitude that are imminent to the same pre-individual flux, but are kind of incipiently separated in this way. So there's the lower and the higher in terms of an order of magnitude. There's the transductive operation that is established as a passage between them, which is communication. This is the origin of information in his view, right? This is his qualitative, like pre-quantitative, pre-discrete way of grounding information theory, and his critique of Shannon and Wiener and all of that is that you don't have this, you just posit. This is the Simondonian solution to the frame problem in some sense, right? But yeah, so this transductive operation is being established, and then the thing that ultimately emerges as the definite mediator of that is kind of the individual, right? Um, but is also just on this note, so on because you brought up the attractor thing, and Tritton quotes Ian Hamilton Grant talking about the idea as a limit attractor, blah blah blah, and blah, 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 what does it say? The apeiron itself, the chora itself, I guess, can be called idea, or better, a generator or attractor of the idea, which is the determinate at the same time, which is what you've just said. But I think that there's a distinction here between a generator and an attractor. And I think that that's important to disambiguate. And I think that the Simondonian view, again, is an attempt to disambiguate this, because it attracts attractors in some sense. It attracts the individual, or it attracts the resolution because it is problematic. But the resolutions themselves, the individuals are in fact the attractors proper. So apeiron is not an individual, i.e., it is not an attractor. It is a generator, but it is, it's pregnant with incipient attractors.
Mm.
Um,
Right, right. Whenceforth the elements are generated. Um, yeah. Um, Ian Hamilton Grant has this book, Philosophies of Nature After Schelling, that I think really was my first exposure to this reading of. I mean, that was my first exposure to Schelling, actually. It was during that speculative realism moment back around 2010, 2011. And Ian Hamilton Grant was one of the four major figures. And I was immediately drawn. I mean, I loved Graham Harman's stuff. I certainly wrestled with Ray Brassier's unabashed nihilism, um, and Ian Hamilton Grant, and there was a fourth. I was who was the
Meillassoux.
Meillassoux, of course, yeah, Quentin Meillassoux. And it was always Grant that felt most compelling to me and got me into Schelling initially. It was because of Grant's book, Philosophies of Nature After Schelling, that I, really dove into Schelling's primary texts, at least the English translations of them. Um, but this reading of Plato as a physicist was bizarre to me. And I think Grant sometimes might push that too far and actually, talking about the ideas as physical, at least in the sense of like dynamic attractor states or something. Um, and I don't,
Is Grant is he's coming out of like post-structuralism, isn't he? Because he's a translator of Lyotard and stuff. But I think he's also read his
yeah.
Deleuze,
Oh
So I
yeah,
think maybe he is doing a little bit of a Deleuzification as well, right? Uh,
absolutely. Um, and but I like his reading of Schelling a lot. But actually, long before Grant, there's a book by Esposito called Schelling's Philosophy of Nature, I think, and he's already making the connections to self-organization and systems theory, and reading Schelling in this way. So that was a natural connection, to make. Um,
It's because again, Schelling is what? I mean, he's completely immersing himself of the science in the science of the late,
mm,
what is it, 18th and early 19th centuries, and that's the nascent biology is like again a huge, huge source of influence for him, right? As well as the physics of his time and all of that. And is it at all surprising that in the kind of DNA for a heavy-handed metaphor of contemporary science, that 18th century science is and is in there, and indeed, as we've discussed previously, and what's his name, Robert Richards. I'm having a
Richard
mind.
Richards, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And his charting of all the connections between, which again are very obvious in many ways, but between, you know 18th century, late 18th century, early 19th century naturalism and romanticism,
Mhm.
and that's the milieu that Darwin grows up in. And then we're talking about Darwin as an influence on Boltzmann, and that being the trajectory that leads towards the development of complex system science, and blah blah blah. All of these things are like, you know very, very interwoven, and that's hardly surprising in a way, right?
Yeah.
And even
Yeah.
like,
And I mean, the um, importance of Schelling's reading of Plato as a for Grant is that it allows you to overcome this Kantian understanding of nature, where Kant defines nature as the sum total of sensible bodies, basically,
mm,
apparent or phenomenal bodies. And Schelling's, return to Plato allows us to acknowledge that there's actually something uh, invisible at work in nature. There are formal causes in nature, in other words. And so where Kant got mm, put the brakes on with organism as merely a regulative principle, Schelling really goes all in and makes that constitutive by
yeah,
by allowing nature to um, partake in these formal and final causes. Um, and that, this is how Grant puts it. It is precisely the excess or let me get the whole quote here. The emergence of the generated world challenges the senses to exceed their own genesis,
mm,
entailing a
mm,
gaze, and he quotes Timaeus, a gaze fixed on what always is, on the idea in nature, despite the idea itself being necessarily nonsensible or invisible. It is precisely the excess of physical becoming over the phenomenologically accessible, in other words,
mm,
how Kant defines nature as the sum total of appearing bodies,
mm,
um, that prompts Schelling's Timaeus essays epigraph to discover the producer and father of the universe is a great undertaking and impossible to declare to all. So,
yeah,
it's bringing that sense, and this is the receptacle is trying to get at that invisible aspect of nature that's non-corporeal, right?
yeah,
And so it's naturalism without materialism, basically.
yeah. But I think it's so implicit, or really even, I guess, explicit in all of the things that we've been talking about in terms of autonomy and the numinous, that the thing is always the thing, nature, that, whatever is your big capitalized term for the shebang, is excessive. Uh, and again, you can find that, and this is again, one of the places where evolutionary theory brings that into science in a particular way, but you can find that operation, or you can find the analog of that excess at every layer of reality that you look at. Like, to the extent that there are layers of reality, to the extent that we have a kind of hierarchical or indeed heterarchical notion of reality, the heterarchy is that there are others that might be horizontally related to one, but are outside of one's own kind of sphere of influence, or one's own, form, defined at that scale, because if it's the scale above, you could be together in the same organization, but then from the perspective of that form above looking down, your variations would be arbitrary. They would be noise in some sense, like they would be canalized, and they would be, oscillate or circulating, around, cycling around some attractor state, which you, the level above, I mean, why am I saying you? I don't know, but which the level above, so to speak, in a hierarchical complex systems kind of conception, the level above is the virtual governor, or is the attractor in a certain sense that's canalizing the lower level. But the variations of the particulars are, that are not captured by that cyclical solenoidal, attractor mediated thing, are noise. They're arbitrary in relation to that level. But again, that's precisely what you need to be able to move to another attractor state at that level. So to the extent that reality is both hierarchical and hierarchical, and it is both, even if there are pernicious hierarchies that we don't want to, affirm. This is a statement about numinosity and the autonomy of variation at all levels. So something is always excessive of any given frame, and that affords the capacity for the development of novel frames. So that's just like incredibly important. And I think that Schelling is already getting that from Kant, because I think that that's very much the way Kant divides up the world. It's just that he then wants to say, well, the thing that's beyond the frame, we can't speak of that about that, like the thing in itself, we cannot even infer off the transcendental horizon. We can't infer its structure from the surface. If it's kind of like a hologram bulk metaphor now in cosmology, it's saying we can't infer anything about the organization of the bulk from the hologram. Maybe that's a heavy-handed metaphor, but it's like saying in fringe principle terms, you can't infer anything. And I mean, people say things like that, but I don't think like, well, you can't say, you can only read the character of the system or whatever, the properties of the system off the Markov blanket. But I don't think anyone thinks that there's a complete disconnect between the internal, at this level of description, character states and the states that you are inferring off the boundary. That's what is the difference between a reasonable or a good inference and a bad one. Like if there were no connection, you wouldn't be able to make a good inference, and therefore you wouldn't be able to have an effective theory. To connect this back to coarse graining, an effective theory is a level of description of reality which doesn't try to capture all the details of the microstates that are like subtending it, but it's effective to the extent that it gives us a grip. And it's only effective because there is a principled relationship between the microstates and the layer at which we are,
Yeah.
formulating. So,
And when it comes to cosmology, I mean, this is the anthropic principle again that, we can think of what Plato is doing as just, you know, anthropomorphism of the crudest kind. But if we perform this Schellingian inversion, then all of a sudden, our mind is the way it is, and has these tendencies to project things because nature is the way it is, and we are natural beings, and so, Schelling says, in his the introduction to his ideas for a philosophy of nature, which is only a few years after this Timaeus essay, 1797. He says we require to know how and why nature originally and necessarily grounds everything that our species has ever thought about nature. And so this is his inversion of Kant. It's nature is a priori now instead of mind. And that totally reconfigures this issue of anthropomorphism and allows us to avoid the opposite extreme of anthropocentrism, right?
yeah.
We're the only minded creatures in the universe.
No, I of course really love that. I was
So,
looking for, yeah, go on.
well, just this other line from Grant where he exemplifies this, like Schelling would say, um, you can't have epistemology until you have geology. uh, or you can't have geology until you have an earth, is how he'd really put it. Like, and the Kantian way of construing things puts you in the absurd situation of having to say geology comes before the earth, right? Like, as if we can't access or know the real earth. We can only know, what are the structures of our own intuition and categories allow us to know about the earth. And there's a certain absurdity as soon as you start to grasp the evolutionary um, picture to the Kantian project, or at least you're forced to historicize it. Um,
Yeah, and I think there are hardline Kantians who are sort of, want to make the argument that that's exactly what is forbidden, and that anyone trying to extend Kant in exactly that way, and I guess Herder is like, public enemy number one, because he's even convincing Kant to do that. And then I think some of these Kantians who are like first critique Kantians think Kant is then already at odds with himself in the second and third critiques, and not to mention in his anthropology and blah, blah, blah. And they can obviously point at all these places where Kant will, of course, say like racist things and, stupid things of his, and say, well, that's exactly because he's beyond the strictures of his own, the boundary that he has erected. And I
I
mean,
was
yeah,
just on the funny joke real quick. I just heard about a French psychiatrist or neurologist who I guess was partial to the early Kant and
uh,
tried to diagnose the later Kant from the 1780s onward as suffering from a brain tumor and so becoming progressively less coherent.
less rigorous, right? Because he's more conjectural. He becomes
Yeah.
more speculative philosopher. And I mean, I always say this, and maybe it's a bit pat and a bit trite, a bit facile to say it, but he does write, and everyone says, yes, it's a terrible introduction to the first critique and blah, 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 which it was sort of ostensibly intended to be, but the prolegomena to any future metaphysics. It's like he's not saying that we shouldn't be speculative, conjectural, or whatever. We should just keep in mind, our limitations when we do that.
Mhm.
So like any great philosopher, he admits of various readings. I mean, so I can't find the exact quote that I was looking for, but Schelling says in the Timaeus essay, the key to the explanation of the entirety of Platonic philosophy is noting that Plato everywhere carries the subjective over to the objective. And
Mhm.
there are a number of similar quotes that he makes, and of course, one way of reading that is in the sort of the jokey way that I said that, oh well, Plato is a subjectivist. That's what Schelling is showing, but no, he's showing that exactly what you were just saying very eloquently. That the subjective always has to be bound up in the objective. For in fact, like the objective is the condition of the subjective, just as the autonomy of the other is the condition for the autonomy of oneself or whatever, right? Well, not in exactly the same way. That's maybe a heavy-handed comparison, but there's some kind of similarity there. But what I was looking for, and I think this also goes to the Jungian thing from the beginning, or just Jung's view in general, it's like that autonomy and that numinosity of nature, which is also within oneself, which is the sense in which one can be at odds with oneself, which is the sense in which the psyche is inhabited by all of the, by the Kabiri, but by all of these diverse, autonomous kind of substructures and blah, blah, blah. So nature is within and without. We can't understand that through pure reason. We can't understand that in this purely rational or analytic way, but we do understand it, or we know that it exists by being it. We are that. We are this tensed, problematic, more than a unity, to use the Simondonian phrases now. And that's part of how we know. It just so happens that everywhere else we look, we see the same shit going on, but it's part of how we know that that is, in fact, how nature is. We know it because we are it.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. Um, did you get through all of your Quora uh quotes there? Was there any more, or should we?
I think that's where I was
Mhm.
wanting to get to. There are definitely others, but the next section, so the description of primitive chaos is 20, and then 21 is the four bodies and the regular solids and all of that. So then he gets into, his kind of back into the characteristics of the elements and the theory of forms and the Platonic solids and all of that, which is not really where I wanted to go with this discussion.
Mhm.
So yeah, no, I think I got through all of that. But there's definitely stuff in the Triton essay that we can turn to.
Yeah, I'm looking at my notes there to see if there's anything else that I wanted to dwell on. I mean, there's some neat correspondences between Schelling's account of the originary longing. This is in a footnote, footnote 5 in the Triton article. Um, the originary longing of the 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 chora, that it's this undulating, surging, motion is a longing for um, understanding, a longing for the nous, just as the nous is longing for um, to become visible to itself, and so the receptacle functions as a kind of mirror. But this account of the original longing for Schelling, it strikes me as so similar to Whitehead's account of the primordial nature yearning after actuality. And so there's this unconscious. Um, so we could say that while the receptacle is not ordered in an intellectual way, in a proportional, rational way, there's a deeper source of order that's coming from that's erotic. There's this desire, this I mean that's the element of soul, I guess. And so there's a desire for understanding, right? And I think what Schelling is trying to say is that everything begins in that desire, and that intellect comes later and isn't um,
Mhm.
the source of intellect doesn't itself um, want anything. You know, if it's simply the perfect forms, then there's no reason for anything to happen.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's the Laplacian and mechanical philosophy in which there is no place in nature for purpose and function and all of that because everything is just happening. You know, nothing really wants anything, but we apparently do. And one of the
yeah,
things we want is to project desire onto these things in a very naive manner. But it's like, okay, so is
yeah.
that outside of the cosmos in that case? Like, where does that come from?
Yeah. So,
Um,
you know, another in the freedom essay, Schelling will call this primal will. He'll say he'll say primal being is will, or will is primal being, right? And so it's a blind will.
Schopenhauer will get it from, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so one of the things that does come up a number of times in the Triton essay in connection to that is because I think there's still a certain Platonic or even Neoplatonic reading that Triton is trying to recover here. You know, like certain things are being inverted, but um, so there's this discussion often of desire as lack, right? So to put it in the terms that you just gave us, you know, we lack nous, we lack the understanding,
Mhm.
um, but therefore we always want it, and you know we're always yearning for it. And I would agree that that's in fact a real dynamic. You know, like we encounter something we don't understand, we shrink from it in many ways. We're afraid of uncertainty. You know, we could go into a discussion of conspiracy theories and all sorts of things at this point because sometimes we try to convince ourselves that we do understand something when in fact we don't, and we have no place imagining that we do. But I would also just like to point out that kind of the lack is not. I mean, this is a big discussion in like psychoanalytic circles and stuff, right?
Yeah.
But is the lack primary? Or is it in fact the excess that is primary, such that we're continually, again, at odds with ourselves, at odds with everything in some sense, and everything is doing this, is excessive and continually overflowing. And that's why there's a constant generation of lack. But it starts off as a positive thing, like we're always running to catch up. We're Red Queen type dynamics. You know, we're always running to catch up with ourselves and the other, which is continually varying. And this is also why I don't like this would be a different discussion that we've had before, but I don't think you need to posit a primordial principle of increase of complexity, for example. That will happen as a byproduct of excess, because you'll be in this Red Queen situation where you're constantly having, you know, and you can go into Ashby's good regulator theorem and make it all cybernetic and quite fun, if one finds that kind of thing fun. But you can combine these things in cool ways. But like right at the end, so there's a number of times where Triton sort of positively, no pun intended, affirms that the lack seems kind of primary and it's about the return to the one. And right at the end, when he's summing up, he says that for Schelling, things must not revert to the one to acquire their oneness. So in the emanationist Neoplatonic scheme, right, the one is the effusive, excessive thing, and things are like falling out of it. There's this trickle down thing going on, and then they're in the fallen world, but they feel the lack, they feel the loss. They're not, you know, they're wanting to find unity again, so they have to return to the one, and that is the ascent back to the good, right?
Mhm.
That's the classic Neoplatonic scheme, and he talks about, you know, Nietzsche's kind of satirization of that and how Schelling doesn't see it that way, because for Schelling, things must not revert to the one to acquire their oneness, but the one acquires its unity all the more intensely the more things progress towards greater degrees of unity yet unknown. The one is produced or constructed, not disseminated. So obviously there are parts of that which I like, but you can imagine exactly what I'm going to say, that I don't think like the achievement of unity is not the end goal because there's always more diversification on the other side of that. And so I would just say things don't progress towards unity. It's like in the alchemical sense, salve and coagula, differentiation, the salve, the solubilizing of the thing into the mixture, the mixing up, and then the condensation, and that's the generative process of like diversification and unification and diversification and unification, and that's just some sort of primordial tension which never goes away. Like there's no final, like only death is the end for some very limited being anyway, because I don't think that we need to posit the heat death of the whole cosmos. Just by the way, I mean, I'm always saying that. Because the
Yeah.
whole thing is open-ended, and what makes it open-ended is that there's no final unity, like any. And again, this is very Jungian. This Jung takes this from alchemy, but I think it's a standard kind of evolutionary picture as well. Like the differentiation is always occurring. So it's like if you were to have variation, selection, and inheritance, and you were to imagine that variation was given once and for all, and then there was a winnowing process of variation. There was a selective ingression of particular variations at each stage of the process, if we're thinking of natural selection as an algorithm, as some people like to, and eventually you would converge on all of the variation is now saturated, is now exhausted rather, and we've reached final unity. That's Peirce's vision of the escapper crystal, the crystal at the end of time. That to me is not an empirical vision, and we don't need it. Because in fact, what happens is that variation is the first and it is continually generated. And so at every step of that algorithmic process, again, if one wants an algorithmic, schematization, there is a new set of variation injected. Variation continually is injected. And if you look at models of evolvability and actually their application to real empirical systems, not just as abstract models, that's what happens. It's systems that can continually accumulate variation are evolvable. Systems that do that up to a certain limit, they become basically specialized into kind of dead ends, and they're all good until the environment changes to a certain degree, and then they're done, they go extinct. So yeah, that's a thing that I would still reject. That seems to be a kind of vestigial, maybe Neoplatonism in Tritton's reading, and then there are a few other similar such
Hmm.
things that I would take exception to, I think.
I mean, there's the neat point where he talks about the good only being good because it is effusive and that there's something extra. There's that and that it becomes good through matter. That that it's consequently good because of uh um the sp spilling over down through all the hypostases to matter, and then which allows for the return. And so it's as though the one gains something
Yeah.
by fully losing itself in the material.
But
Uh,
isn't it even though, there's a footnote, I know somewhere that says this, that it's more like in the Schillingian reading that the chora or matter is the precondition of the good. It's not just that it's an
mm.
enriching of the good. That's where the good comes from in the first place, right? There is no good without that.
No,
Um,
yeah, no, precisely. Yeah.
and
Uh,
of course, I like that. I very much agree that I believe that there are goods, not in
yeah.
a
Yeah. No, he says the bastard reading of Proclus, he's going through Proclus's propositions, but the bastard reading offered here um, suggests that the one too has acquired something more, something extra, namely its goodness through its consequent matter. The good is only good because it is extra one, that is more than one. The good is good because it bestows oneness on the participating and reverting, even though it itself in the production of matter surpasses oneness. It produces an extra, a supplement to the one. Um, so the
Yeah,
good
no.
is constituted through matter, which thus proves the one's effusiveness and generates the need for reversion. Um,
Mm. But also, yeah, he says in this footnote 63, the Schellingian position, however, in comparison to the Platinian position, views matter as that precondition without which the good could not come to be, rather than viewing it as an impediment to the good. So if it's a
right.
genuine first, it pre-exists the good, it pre-exists the one unless it is the one, right? And that would be where I would go, because I think that again, if the primordial actuality is the chora, essentially, right, the pre-individual state, that is also the primordial togetherness. It's a many one, as we've discussed, so it's a multiplicity, but it's also together. Um, and that's why I don't think you need an additional principle to hold it together. I don't think it's at risk of flying apart. I think it's imminently doing this differentiation and unification thing, but I don't think it needs something to go like, you know, um,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean that's the move I make in my book Physics of the World Soul when I really go into the Timaeus. I want to have a more androgynous reading of the ultimate. And so that would mean the chora not just being the mother, but some kind of queer combination of father and mother, or you know, um, maternal and paternal principles, where in some sense, that's why the title of the book, World, Physics of the World Soul, is like we have to start in the middle, start with the mixture, start with the third thing, instead of thinking we could ever begin with the two as separate principles.
mm. Yeah, no, I've read that book, but it was quite a while ago. I can't remember all the stuff, but I like it. I definitely like what you're saying. Just back I'm flicking through my notes here, or flicking through my annotated version of the article and looking
Yeah.
for what I
We
wanted to
should,
say.
we're gonna need to wrap up soon because
Oh,
Philo is gonna stab me in the back pretty soon if he
totally,
doesn't get fed.
totally, totally
He's
get it.
like, he's digging in his food bowl hoping to find something in there, but it's not gonna work.
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the so again, just another critique of unity, I guess, and critique of all of these models of fallenness and the need to return to unity, and return to the good and all of that, is that I think that that's essentially the Buddhist what Buddhism exists to critique that position in some sense, right?
Hmm.
Um, and also there's a Lacanian critique where sort of Lacan and then there's the Deleuze-Guattarian critique of Lacan. But the object, the petit objet art that we lack, is not like a real thing that you're going to get it and then be satisfied that you have finally achieved that unity, with the other, with the object or whatever. It's like the cause of suffering in a lot of in these ways of thinking is the reification of the one in this sense as the thing to return to, like the desire to return to the primordial unity, because in fact you are. And again, it's a condition of generativity. It's a condition of adaptivity. It's a condition of improvisation. All of these things that, in fact, we love. So we actually love a life that's rich and full of discord in many ways, although it can become too much. Um, a condition of having diversity and all of that is this never-ending process of diversification and coming back together, not the seeking of the primordial. And there's all sorts of critiques of there's a critique of the free energy principle as if it's read as an optimality, principle, right? Um, oh, and then there's some stuff also which is related, I think, about there's a lot of discussion of the medieval doctrine that the effect cannot contain more being than the cause, and Schelling again with the inversion here, saying that no, the effect actually contains more than the cause. And I like the Schellingian move, obviously, but again, I want to say no, it's bidirectional. So here would be, and I'm not going to go into it now, but a way to bring in a notion alongside constructive coarse graining and endogenous coarse graining, but of bidirectional coarse graining. So the
Hmm.
kind of emergent level, which is consequent, has degrees of freedom that don't exist at the subtending level, and it achieves those by organizing the degrees of freedom of the subtending level. But it's also less information rich in important ways. So in emergence, it's not that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. It's that in many ways it's radically less. So you need that's what makes an effective theory an effective theory. You don't need to specify all of the details in association with the microstates. Again, that's how I think nature complexifies in an endogenous manner. But there is a genesis of something novel, so it contains things. So without fully mapping to this here, it's the effect does contain things that the cause doesn't contain. So it's more than, but it's also less than. So it's not one or the other. And then, this feeds into these discussions of superiority and inferiority because another Neoplatonic thing that Schelling is said to affirm here, and Tritton sort of is affirming, is he's reversing the order of emanationism, but he's still preserving the hierarchy in the sense, and again, I said nature, the world is hierarchical in important ways, but that as we are still ascending towards the one now. It's like Teilhardian almost, isn't it? You would know better than I if that's a decent analogy, but it seems like it might be. We're moving towards the good. The good will be constructed. It's a constructivism. That's awesome. But, that omega point is in fact the good. And of course, this goes along with the classic human exceptionalism. So a form of anthropocentrism that creeps back in, which is massive in Hans Jonas. Humans are, even though Hans Jonas is softening the anthropocentrism of Heidegger in really important ways, he's still saying that humans are the most important things in the world. And I get that. I'm a human, and we'll talk about Jonas in more detail another time. Like I think there are important reasons to affirm that, but at the same time, I can recognize that I think that humans are super important because I'm a human in some sense. And also, like I think my daughter is the most important human in the world because she's my daughter, not because, she actually is, like in some objective sense. But
Mhm.
on the children thing and the cause containing more or less than, or the anterior or the prior containing more or less than the consequent. And so this ties into the inferior and the superior, right? Is a child inferior to an adult? Like in what sense? Like how are you going to quantify that? How are you going to measure that? Children have way more potential than adults, right? They can become a lot more things than adults. They're much less canalized than adults, modulo environment and a lot of other things. But of course, adults have a lot of degrees of freedom that children don't have. So by the fact that we are inherently less generative and less babbling, we're less chaotic, we've got less of that, we're less choratic, whatever the right adjectival form of the choric would be, than children. Less dynamic, in the Aristotelian sense. We're more kinetic though. That may seem silly to parents of small children whose children are running around screaming all the time because they're highly kinetic. But you know what I mean? Like we have degrees of freedom that come from our developmental history of organization, but we necessarily actually have there's our possibility space, or that region of the possibility space which can be reached from where we are now, is also less than a child, again, given if they had all the same opportunities that we had, or some like ridiculous, it's a ridiculous thought experiment in a sense. All I'm trying to say, because children are not more or less than adults. All I'm trying to say is that you have to have a bidirectional scheme here, not an inferiority to superiority, or less or more in the antecedent, less or more in the consequent. It's bidirectional, and that's really important. Bidirectional coarse graining and effective theories. Mathematical descriptions, for example, might be highly, highly precise, and they might describe, you might have a highly precise mathematical model that can, in fact, describe, microstates of a system at a level of detail that, that words would never capture the precision, right? So in some sense, that mathematical description could be described as more information rich, but it has no qualities in it, you know? It's a whole lot of shit that's really important that exists at our level, which is just gone from that. And that's why reductionism fails, because in fact the relationship here is bidirectional. It's not that if you had the Laplacian description, or Maxwell's demon type thing of like all the microstates in exhaustive detail, in some sense, that would be more information rich than, the description that is in fact accessible to us. But in another sense, it would be very radically denuded, hence bidirectional coarse graining. Anyway, that was a bit of a rant, but um,
Yeah. Schelling talks about and he's thinking about the Trinity here, but this logical paradox whereby the father only becomes the father after the daughter is born, and so in some sense, the daughter makes the father doesn't make the daughter. Right? But it is bidirectional ultimately because yeah, it goes both ways. Um, and and then in terms of the
So Schelling says that, right? Because that Jung
yeah,
obviously says exactly Jung says exactly the same thing, right?
I'm pretty sure Schelling says that, if I'm not mistaken, it's either in Ages of the World or the Freedom Essay, but Jung was definitely reading Schelling too. So, um, but in terms of cause and effect and the term moving image of eternity, and I think there's a way in which the Platonic conception of time is a closed circle. And that stems from a kind of astronomical mysticism around the what's called the Platonic year, and the sense that, oh wow, this whole thing goes in a circle. Um, Time comes back to where it began again. And the Pythagoreans killed people who talked about irrational numbers, and
Quite hard.
so the legend has it at least. But obviously there's a sense in which these astronomical motions give us the most precise measurements we could ask for, but there's still a remainder. There's always an irrationality to it. Like the circle doesn't close. It's a spiral. It's open-ended. There's this element of chaos in the mixture. Um, and but Plato's also pointing that out, but there's still this residual like Pythagorean, Parmenidean hope or faith or grasping after, perfect unity. And Schelling is more historical, and this is the whole thing about the move to a positive philosophy. It's a shift from, Triton has a shift from the circle to the line. I think it's more like a spiral because there's, obviously still something about this Platonic view that Schelling wants to carry forward. But when we think about time as a moving image of eternity, I think what I find impossible not to continue to wrestle with is some sense of there being a proportionality between past and future. And what I mean by that is, I mean, the crude form of it is Teilhard's. I mean, I shouldn't say Teilhard is crude. I mean, it's such a beautiful vision, but it's just an evolutionary version of Plotinus, like, you know, um, back to the one, and there's not much room for contingency in that story. Um, but I still find the need for some type of proportionality. And what I mean by that is um, that that past and future uh, are ontologically distinct in the sense that the future hasn't happened yet, but that this, and Whitehead accomplishes this proportionality with his consequent nature of God, that like there's some sense in which despite all of the contingency and despite the open-endedness of the future, there's still a sense moment by moment that uh, uh, wholeness is being recomposed, reachieved, always again. And it's not the same wholeness that we may have had before.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Coming
Uh,
apart. Right. Yeah.
Sorry, I like the hand gesture, but I didn't hear the word.
Coming apart, coming together, coming apart,
Oh,
coming together, what
yeah,
we've been talking about,
right. It's a very, I mean, yeah, I was imagining you were trying to describe like mitosis or something there, but the,
it could have been.
that is, the sexual dimorphism, I think, is a good image for this process of creativity where there's like a hidden wholeness that we never achieve, but we constantly seek it out, and it's what drives the evolutionary process. Um, and Schelling's whole account of what he called dynamic evolution through a series of stages and a gradual intensification at each stage is this process whereby he refers to two infinite forces, but in Plato's sense, it's the limited and the unlimited, the paras and the aperon. Every stage of nature's development and every creature, every organism is a sort of temporary uh, equilibrium of these two principles. I don't want to say it's not actually an equilibrium because every organism dies, and there's an open-ended evolution whereby new species are being brought forth because of the slight disequilibrium. And like this goes on at every level from and he uses analogies here, and he's been criticized for just being, too loosely analogical in his account of nature, but he'll talk about light and gravity as this original polarity of, of forces finding proportion, and then electricity and magnetism, and then sensibility and irritability at the level of life, and so on and so forth, where the process is kept open-ended and slightly out of equilibrium, but nonetheless, there are these sort of temporary unities achieved like all along the way, right? That allow for this hierarchy or holarchy of nature to emerge.
I mean, I think, yeah, well, but beautiful. Those temporary equilibria are, of course, far from equilibrium in the global sense.
Yeah.
Uh, they are non-equilibrium steady states, broadly speaking. And then you can think of them then as, if you think of equilibrium as the Gibbs surface of absolute stability, that's unity, right? That's when all frustrations are exhausted, as we talked about in the natural induction video, which didn't get a lot of love. But anyway, that video didn't get a lot of views, but um,
Too
whatever. Uh,
complicated.
Too complicated, maybe. But maybe I was just waffling. I usually am. Um, but that is unity. That's that surface. All frustrations are exhausted. All of the tension is gone. It's like the oceanic thing, and we find that metaphor in so many different philosophers, and the discharge of excitation, like Peirce will talk about that as an epistemological thing as well, right? Um, and even though he's a fallibilist, so he thinks we're always going to be in some, disequilibrium, state. In a sense, the goal, the ideal, is the convergence on that absolute state of stability. And I mean, again, he has that baked into his evolutionary realism with the crystal at the end of time. Um, but I like to think of those non-equilibrium steady states, or those temporary equilibria, as dynamic plateaus, right? So they're like way up above the surface of absolute stability, because they are, they are maintained by these frustrated many body systems. So a condition of a temporary unity, as opposed to a final unity, which is the death of everything. The death of everything is the final unity. A condition of a temporary unity is the maintenance of disequilibrium. Is the maintenance of internal diversity. And so, yeah, it is a tension in that sense. So we're always like locally resolving. We're locally going down some little gradient to find the local equilibrium, but at the same time, we're desperately maintaining a disequilibrium on a more global scale. Otherwise, we're dying. And again, the principle of evolvability is like the system that can accumulate more variation whilst remaining functional has the capacity to generate more novel forms. And I mean, that ties in really nicely to epistemology in a sense. And I guess even I want to connect it with Socrates and kind of like, the examined life, ending in, or not ending in, but one achieves the realization of one's own ignorance. One achieves the realization of how little one knows, but doesn't give up, doesn't go, oh, well, I'm never going to know, but is constantly driven to know more and more. In a sense, that's a drive to differentiate one's understanding, in the recognition that the fantasy of total understanding was, in fact, a misapprehension of that unity, that death state, when in fact, all that we really can do is continue to differentiate ourselves. And how much differentiation, and how much you know complexity can we bring into our kind of model of the world, and keep trying to unify it, keep trying in a sense to fulfill some sort of principle of coherence, and all of those things which Whitehead rightly points out, and he's far from alone in pointing out that those are really important for any kind of scheme, certainly an attempt to rationalize any kind of scheme. We keep trying to do that, but we recognize that it's never ending. And every time we learn something new, which hopefully we do every day, to quote the cliche, we have another task of reunification, and then we do it again, and we do it again, and we do it again, and that's what it is to live that examined life, and that's what it is to be an evolvable, adaptable system as well.
Hmm. Yeah. Maybe we can close with a couple of quotes from Schelling here.
Please.
Um, these are from Ideas for Philosophy of Nature again. He says, for what we want is not that nature should coincide with the laws of our mind by chance, but that she herself, necessarily and originally, should not only express, but even realize the laws of our mind, that she is and is called nature only insofar as she does so. Um, Interesting use of pronouns here, right? With, I mean, Plato earlier and now Schelling
Yeah.
referring to the feminine. And the last one
Mm.
here, man is not born to waste his mental powers in conflict against the fantasy of an imaginary world, but to exert all his powers upon a world which has influence upon him, lets him feel its forces, and upon which he can react. Between him and the world, therefore, no rift shall be established. Contact and reciprocal action must be possible between the two. I thought of that one when you were talking about the Markov blankets and how, like,
Yeah. No, I think it's beautiful. And I think we're not going to go here now. We've said it before to some degree, but I find it really bizarre and funny. And I don't have some of my pithy little ideas ready. I can't remember, but that instrumentalism is the philosophy of saying that, we can't say anything about the nature of reality. We can only, grip it in some way. But it's like the fact that the theory is effective, the fact that it is an instrument, the fact that it's more or less apt, right? That's a selection principle. And what is the selector? That's the system you're trying to, interact with, instrumentalize. Instrumentalism it should be a realist philosophy, right?
yeah,
It should
yeah, for sure.
just weird that it becomes this is, mutant anti-realism in the 20th century. The technical, the technicity is all about a real reciprocal engagement with the world and like bringing some degrees of freedom of the broader environment under our control through a certain kind of understanding of them. That's what techne is.
Yeah,
And all
yeah,
mechanisms
yeah.
do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's this dualism that um, wants to put mind outside of the matter being manipulated, that I think it's very difficult to overcome because you almost have to think these difficult uh, concepts that are um, between. They're like mediating concepts. They're the third kind, that's not as clear and distinct as the extremes that we're, I think, more comfortable thinking in terms of. Um,
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Can I be really mean, like really inappropriate and read a Simondon quote, even though we were going to end with those?
that's fine.
I just found one, and I think it's really nice. And I think this was one of the quotes that I shared with you that made you think of Goethe. And
Hmm.
so I think we're in that space already. But Simondon says, Ionian physiology, with its trust in all the human means of perceiving, particularly its trust in the most concrete means of perceiving and those closest to everyday operations, is the basis of all realist doctrines of knowledge. The human being isn't isolated from objects. What he, again, perceived is real, for the knowledge of objects appears in the reciprocity of real exchanges between the operator and the raw material that will become an object. Perception reaches the reality of the object because it takes place during the object's active genesis, which is its fabrication. The subject is not at a distance from the object because, in fact, the subject of knowledge is the operator, the fabricator of the object. The world is perceived as a set of constructed, arranged, and produced objects. Hence, what emerges with realism and the postulate of continuity in this first philosophy of nature is the importance of duration, of genesis as the dimension of perceptive intelligibility. I mean, there's a lot in that, so and there's a transcendental aspect to what he's saying there as well. But he's also saying that it's precisely the grip that we have on the world. And of course, Simondon is this great philosopher of technicity that is the fact is at the basis of a realist conception of knowledge. It's our capacity to interact with in a meaningful way. Um,
Mhm.
that we can be a cause amongst causes.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, there's an anthropocentrism in it, but I think as long as we don't see ourselves as the end of this,
Hmm.
it's not so bad. But Schelling says things like the mind is the highest potency of nature, or nature is nature at its highest potency, you'd say. Um, and we could just soften it and say a higher potency, and there might be
Yeah.
um,
Or,
potencies
or
beyond us. But
Or we could fall back on, I think, where Schelling is already, but also Peirce is, mind is not a human thing. Mind is nature. Like that's almost tautological what Schelling is saying there in a sense. He's not saying the human mind necessarily, although he might sometimes be saying that as well. But he's saying mind is that process of, intense generative evolution as manifest in nature. That is the characteristic of mind. And so Peirce wants to say, like, this is where Peirce goes into his absolute idealism. I wouldn't generalize the terms that way, but I respect
yeah,
that view, obviously. Yeah. No, I think we always want to soften the hard anthropocentrism. And again, it's not because for us, of course, humans are incredibly important, And I grew up in these naturalist circles where it was actually very common for people to say, wouldn't the world be better off without us? And I,
mm,
and I really also dislike that sentiment a great deal. And when I was 17, I was in the Philippines working for this um, monitor lizard researcher, amongst other things, but an ecologist. I've told you about this experience before. It was a really formative experience for me. But he said to me that, he hates that opinion from conservationists. And whenever he works with people in the field who says things like that, he wants to pull his hair out because from his perspective, if we were gone, there would be no one to care about, the loss of other species. Like other species don't care about the loss of other species. Again, I wouldn't want to maximize that point of view, but there is some truth in it. Humans are special, but we're just not as special as we have historically, traditionally liked to think of ourselves as being. Um, and other organisms are also special. Uh,
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's something that Novalis says that Whitehead kind of reiterates. It's the basic romantic idea that like art is
you've gone very blurry, just by the way. I think it's
oh,
too.
my camera is tired, or it's just too dark. Novalis says something like art is the education of the earth,
Mm.
um, which he doesn't mean to say that, you know, uh, art or artifice or techne or like the human being in our artistic and technical capacities is teaching nature how to do it, but that through us, nature teaches itself. It's a self-education, I think, is what the Romantics are really saying there, and what Novalis is saying in this case. Um, but it's very easy for this more or less hermetic idea of the role of the human being to be um, understood as just like the kind of obnoxious anthropocentrism that makes everything about the human and for the human and reduces nature to just raw material for our projects. And then this subtler reading of it, which is that um, you know the the human is the universe become conscious of itself, or uh nature's highest potency in Schelling's terms, that really makes what is that the human becomes the transparency of nature to itself in a way, rather than being some extra thing that's special and not part of nature or set aside um, from nature.
Yeah, and I like all of those softenings of anthropocentrism. I think we could, of course, go further and not again to really undermine those sentiments and those statements, but also to point out that um, nature is always already technical. So technicity is what all functional systems kind of do, So at least the living world, that might be one of the cusps, is we can be described as suffused with technicity in this sense. And then there are more obvious examples. And then also nature is very artistic, and all of the different species signaling mechanisms and all of the incredibly beautiful things that we find beautiful in nature are, I mean, sometimes they're there to warn other animals not to eat them. There's a lot of aposematic coloration that we find beautiful, and sometimes there's camouflage that we find beautiful as well. But there are a lot of things in nature that we find beautiful that are intended to be beautiful, that are designed to be beautiful. And then technicity and art do come together very strikingly in certain animal lineages. And I guess if people haven't heard of a Vogelkop bowerbird, I mean bowerbirds in general, but look at the Vogelkop bowerbird and its thatched thatched construction, these huge bowers. These are in Papua New Guinea, huge bowers which are thatched, and then these incredible like display lawns that they create, and different individuals have different,
Stage design. Yeah.
yeah, and well, stage design, like a lot of bowerbirds and birds of paradise do create stages, clear away all of the leaves and other things so that they can do their crazy dances. I mean, you know, I think in today's day and age, most people know about this kind of stuff because we're so incredibly saturated with and blessed by nature documentaries, like the footage of bowerbirds and birds of paradise that's come out just in the last 10 to 15 years is just mind-blowing. But yeah, I mean, those sorts of things, we shouldn't just look at them and go like, oh, isn't that cool that these birds do this kind of stuff? We should let that, understanding of what's going on there. We should be empathic. We should allow ourselves to be empathic by going, wow, this is a lot like things that I would do or that humans do. And that can then feed back onto our philosophy of nature. And that's the whole, well, nature philosophy. What does Grant say? It's right at the beginning of the Triton article, right? There's that definition of nature philosophy. Um, blah blah blah. Philosophy in its universality before it has been delimited to specific domains. Okay, it's not exactly what I wanted, but it's still nice. But this is biologism or nature philosophy in the sense that our understanding of nature, such that we can gain it, should always be feeding back onto the way we, onto the big problems, the big questions, and the kind of big truisms that characterize the history of philosophy. If you see a Vogelkop bowerbird, like Plato never saw one of those. Heidegger never saw one of those, you know?
Mm.
So
Hmm.
when you read Heidegger and he's talking about, the, you know,
Yeah.
organisms being poor in world and whatever, it's like, well, think about the Vogelkop bowerbird, or whatever example you
Right.
want to choose.
It's like Heidegger went to the zoo and saw all the sad animals and was like, oh.
Like,
Um,
this is boring. I'm going to go back to studying my own mind. And like, cool, man, you're a really good phenomenologist, but you don't know shit about animals.
right, but it's the equivalent of visiting a prison and devising a treatise on human nature based on what you find there instead of, out in the wild. But I think the bowerbirds both allow us to humanize nature, but also it's bidirectional. It naturalizes humanity,
Yeah.
and so uh,
Like, don't underestimate Darwin. We might have issues with some of the things that he says, and also we're not going to say that he's the originator of this view, of course, right? But don't underestimate the seismic event of that reordering of it should be reordering some of these hierarchies that we're talking about still,
yeah,
um, it immanentizes the human, and that's a very important move. And I mean, climate change, conservation, etc., etc. It's really important to understand ourselves in today's day and age as immanent to the environments, the natural forces with which we share this world. And
yeah.
um,
Yeah, I was almost when I was praising Newton for bringing the terrestrial and the celestial together earlier, I was thinking to myself, but Bruno Latour has this great argument for returning to a geocentric view in the sense that, the living Earth is fragile and we shouldn't just equate it with, uh, you know, um, the way we conceive of the physical world writ large, because there's something delicate and precious about Gaia, that makes it unique
two
and deserving of our attention as something special.
100%, but two different levels of description, right? You can have both of those things. At some level of abstraction, there's no difference in certain fundamental forces, and at another level,
Right.
this was our birthplace. It's a place that we are uniquely adapted to, or certain regions of it anyway. We have expanded to otherwise inhospitable regions by our own, technical capacities, obviously, and that also shouldn't be underestimated. Husserl also has a phenomenological argument for
Mm.
geocentricity.
Right.
Like,
Right.
it's the ground on which we walk, like
The original arc does not move. The Earth, the original arc does not move. He scribbled it on a napkin or something, right? That comment.
yeah, but I think he did write more about it as well.
Mm.
But yeah, anyway. Um,
I
cool,
don't.
man. It wasn't
Yeah.
90 minutes, but
That was uh unreasonable to assume we could fit all of that into 90 minutes, but yeah, this was great. Um I'm gonna feed my cat, feed myself,
Yeah.
and I don't know where we're going next, but we'll figure it out on WhatsApp.
Yeah. And I guess we'll do another one in a fortnight. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm down.
Awesome.
All right,
Cool,
Tim.
man. All right, take care, man.
Take care.